The piercing wail of the emergency alert system shattered the pre-dawn silence across Earth's Pacific Fleet Command, like a blade through glass. Admiral Jack Morrison's eyes snapped open in his sparse quarters, decades of military conditioning, overriding the exhaustion that had finally claimed him just 3 hours earlier. The red emergency lights bathed everything in an ominous crimson glow as his personal communication array erupted to life with an urgency he hadn't witnessed since the Titan colony wars. But this wasn't a drill. The quantum-encrypted transmission bore the unmistakable signature of deep space origins, something that should have been impossible given Earth's 30-year isolation from galactic affairs. Morrison's weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he activated the holographic display, his mind already calculating threat assessments and response protocols. What materialized before him, however, defied every scenario the Strategic Defense Council had ever prepared for. The alien figure that flickered into view was barely recognizable as the proud commander. Veltar, he remembered from the old diplomatic archives, the same arrogant bastard who had personally delivered Earth's quarantine notice 3 decades ago. Now, Veltar looked like death itself had taken a personal interest in his suffering. His typically pristine Alliance uniform hung in tatters, dark fluid presumably bloodstaining the fabric. Behind him, Morrison could see the bridge of what had once been a magnificent Alliance cruiser. Now, a hellscape of sparking consoles, emergency lighting, and the unmistakable signs of catastrophic hull breaches. The ship was dying, and everyone aboard knew it. "People of Earth," Veltar began, his voice carrying a tremor that Morrison had never heard from any Alliance officer. "I am Commander Veltar of the Galactic Peace Alliance." The irony wasn't lost on Morrison. Here was a representative of the so-called peaceful organization that had spent 3 decades painting humanity as the galaxy's greatest threat to stability. Yet now, desperation dripped from every word as Veltar continued, "The Devourer Horde has destroyed everything." Morrison's jaw muscles tightened involuntarily. The Devourer Horde was a myth, a boogeyman story whispered in the darkest corners of military intelligence briefings. Ancient biomechanical entities that consumed entire civilizations, growing stronger with each world they devoured. Most analysts had dismissed them as Alliance propaganda designed to justify their massive military expenditures. Apparently, the analysts had been catastrophically wrong. 43 worlds. Veltar's voice cracked like breaking glass, each word punctuated by distant explosions that rocked his dying vessel. Gone, stripped bare, 200 billion souls, just, gone. The alien commander's species didn't cry tears as humans understood them, but something in his compound eyes conveyed a grief so profound it transcended biological differences. Our combined fleet's 6,000 ships, the pride of 17 civilizations, shattered like children's toys against their advance. Morrison leaned forward, his strategic mind automatically cataloging the implications. The Galactic Peace Alliance commanded the most advanced military force in known space, their technology decades ahead of anything in Earth's arsenal. If they had been reduced to begging for help from the very species they had quarantined, then whatever they faced wasn't just dangerous, it was apocalyptic. But here's where things got really interesting, and Morrison couldn't help but appreciate the cosmic irony of the situation. For 3 decades, the Alliance had treated humanity like a pack of rabid wolves that needed to be caged for the galaxy's own good. They had established a strict quarantine zone around the Sol system, banned human vessels from traveling beyond Pluto's orbit, and consistently rejected every diplomatic overture Earth had extended. Hell, they'd even tried to blockade human exploration ships, claiming that humanity's aggressive tendencies and militaristic culture posed an existential threat to galactic peace. And now those same self-righteous peacekeepers were literally begging the monsters to save them. "We know you humans are." Veltar struggled with the words, his pride warring with his desperate circumstances. Violent, dangerous, We've kept you isolated for good reason. Your species' capacity for warfare, your enthusiasm for destruction. He paused as another explosion sent him stumbling against his command chair. But we're dying out here. Our children, our families, entire civilizations being processed like raw materials. Morrison watched this proud alien commander, a being who had once looked down on humanity with such disdain, now reduced to pleading for salvation from the very monsters he had helped cage. There was something almost poetic about it, if you ignored the massive loss of life involved. The Horde doesn't negotiate, doesn't retreat, doesn't show mercy, Veltar continued, his voice rising in panic as warning klaxons began wailing in the background of his transmission. They simply consume everything in their path and move on to the next target. We estimate 3 months before they reach the core worlds, maybe less. His eyes, those alien compound eyes that had once regarded humans with such contempt, now held nothing but terror. Please, help us. You're our last. The transmission cut to static as a brilliant flash consumed the screen. The unmistakable signature of a ship's reactor core going critical. Commander Veltar, the alien who had personally delivered Earth's isolation sentence, had just been vaporized, along with what Morrison assumed were the last survivors of some Alliance task force. Silence filled Morrison's quarters like a physical presence, broken only by the steady hum of the base's life support systems and the distant sound of early morning traffic from the civilian sectors. The Admiral stared at the dead screen for a long moment, his mind processing the implications of what he had just witnessed. After 30 years of forced isolation, of being treated like galactic pariahs, the Alliance was finally acknowledging what Morrison had always known. Sometimes, the monsters weren't the problem. Sometimes the monsters were the solution. His scarred hand souvenirs from the Martian Rebellion and the Europa campaign slowly clenched into fists. These weren't the soft hands of a diplomat or politician. They were the battle-worn tools of a man who had spent his entire adult life perfecting humanity's greatest export, controlled violence. Morrison's voice cut through the silence like a knife. Computer, emergency priority channel, get me General Patricia Hayes at Lunar Command and Admiral Robert Kane at the Jupiter Fleet Yards. Authorization Morrison. Full mobilization protocols. His aide, Lieutenant Commander Stevens, appeared in the doorway, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. The young officer had clearly monitored the transmission and understood the implications. Sir, Stevens began hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. Are we really going to help them? After everything they've done to us? After 30 years of treating us like animals? Morrison's stare could have frozen plasma. It was the look of a man who had made impossible decisions in impossible circumstances, who had ordered good people to their deaths in service of something larger than themselves. Stevens immediately fell silent, recognizing that he had just stepped on a landmine he didn't even know existed. Son, Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. When children are being murdered, you don't ask who's calling for help. You just kill the monsters. But as Stevens saluted and hurried away to execute the mobilization orders, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that the Alliance was about to learn a very hard lesson about the difference between controlled monsters and uncontrolled ones. They had spent 30 years keeping humanity caged, never realizing that the cage wasn't for the galaxy's protection, it was for their own. Now the cage was about to be opened, and God help whatever was waiting outside. 2 miles beneath the Colorado Rockies, in a facility that officially didn't exist on any government documentation, something that had been sleeping for 15 years began to stir. The Cheyenne Deep Storage Complex, known to the handful of people with clearance high enough to even know its name as the Vault, had been humanity's most closely guarded secret since the end of the Titan Wars. Behind blast doors thick enough to survive direct nuclear strikes, past security systems that would make Fort Knox look like a suburban garage, lay weapons so terrifying that Earth's own leaders had agreed they should never see the light of day. Today, those agreements were being torn up and fed into the incinerators. Emergency. Klaxons echoed through corridors that hadn't heard human footsteps in over a decade as automated systems brought the facility's crown jewel back to life. The USS Annihilator stretched for over a mile through the reinforced cavern. A black steel leviathan that represented everything the Galactic Peace Alliance feared about human military engineering. This wasn't just a warship, it was a mobile apocalypse, designed by minds that understood that sometimes the only way to save civilization was to perfect the art of ending it. Captain David Reaper Thompson stepped through the airlock and into the ship he had hoped never to command. The nickname wasn't military bravado or some adolescent attempt at intimidation. Thompson had earned it the hard way, during 3 separate conflicts where he had been forced to make decisions that haunted better men's dreams. At 52, his face bore the kind of lines that came from ordering good people to die for necessary causes, and his eyes held the peculiar emptiness of someone who had looked into the abyss so often that it had started looking back. The ship's corridors hummed with barely contained energy as systems that had been dormant for years awakened with predatory eagerness. Thompson's footsteps echoed against bulkheads lined with weapons systems that violated so many galactic treaties that legal scholars had stopped counting. But here's the thing about treaties. They only matter when both sides are playing by the same rules. The Devourer Horde had never signed any treaties, never agreed to any conventions, never promised to limit their destructive capabilities in the name of civilized warfare, which meant humanity was finally free to show the galaxy what they were really capable of when the gloves came off. "Sir," called out Master Chief Petty Officer Janet Walsh, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of the ship's awakening. "We're receiving confirmation signals from across the fleet. Every mothballed vessel from here to the Jupiter shipyards is coming online." She paused, consulting her tactical display with the kind of professional calm that only came from decades of military service. "It's like watching dinosaurs wake up from extinction." Thompson nodded grimly as he made his way toward the bridge, past weapon systems that made the Alliance's most advanced destroyers look like children's toys. Plasma cannons capable of melting through planetary crusts, antimatter torpedo bays that could crack moons in half. And those were just the conventional weapons. The really nasty stuff was buried deeper in the ship's bowels, behind access codes that required presidential authorization and the kind of security clearances that came with mandatory psychological evaluations. But the awakening wasn't limited to just the Annihilator. Across human space, from the asteroid mining facilities of the Belt to the research stations orbiting Saturn, the call had gone out through encrypted military channels that hadn't been used since the Outer Colony rebellions. Veterans who had thought their fighting days were over suddenly found themselves pulling dusty uniforms from closets and checking the charge on weapons they'd hoped never to use again. Colonel Michelle Rodriguez had been tending her garden on New California when the message reached her. She had earned her retirement after commanding assault carriers through some of humanity's bloodiest campaigns. Her tactical brilliance matched only by her absolute refusal to accept defeat. The Vengeance, her old ship, had been scheduled for decommissioning in 6 months. Instead, Rodriguez found herself back in the captain's chair, surrounded by a crew that looked at her with the kind of reverence usually reserved for legends. "Ma'am," her executive officer reported, his voice tight with excitement, "all fighter squadrons are reporting ready for deployment. The hellhounds are practically vibrating in their cockpits." He couldn't help but grin. "I think they've been missing the action." Rodriguez's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. The hellhounds were humanity's elite fighter pilots, men and women who flew ships designed to outmaneuver anything the galaxy could throw at them. More importantly, they were the kind of people who saw a battle against impossible odds not as a suicide mission, but as a challenge worth accepting. Meanwhile, in the outer colonies, where civilization got a little rougher around the edges, Commander Tyler Brooks, was leading his squadron of stealth destroyers on a high-speed burn toward the rally point. Brooks commanded the kind of ships that officially didn't exist, vessels designed to slip past enemy sensors like ghosts, delivered devastating strikes, and vanish before their targets even knew they were under attack. His crews were recruited from the Outer Rim settlements, places where survival often depended on being faster, smarter, and more ruthless than whoever was trying to kill you this week. And then there was Lisa Shadowblade Martinez, whose very presence at the rally point would have caused several government oversight committees to have collective heart attacks. Martinez was, technically speaking, a pirate, though she preferred the term independent contractor with flexible moral guidelines. Her fleet consisted of ships that had been stolen, salvaged, or built in shipyards that kept very poor records. But Martinez and her crews possessed something that no military academy could teach: the absolute certainty that in a universe full of people trying to kill you, the only rational response was to kill them first. Captain, her first mate, reported from the bridge of her flagship Blood Moon. Our weapon systems are reading at 110% efficiency. The crews are enthusiastic about having legitimate targets for once. Martinez's laugh was like broken glass. Tell them to save some enthusiasm for the actual killing. We're going to need it. But it was Thompson's ship that would spearhead humanity's response. And as he finally reached the bridge of the Annihilator, he understood the weight of what they were about to unleash. Lieutenant Colonel James Bulldog Harrison, the ship's weapons officer, was running diagnostics on systems that had been designed by engineers who understood that sometimes the only way to ensure peace was to make war so terrible that nobody wanted to fight anymore. Status report, Bulldog, Thompson commanded, settling into the captain's chair that had been custom-built to his specifications 15 years ago. Harrison's scarred face, courtesy of a plasma grenade during the Martian siege, lit up with professional satisfaction. Sir, all primary weapon systems are online and hungry. We've got planet crackers loaded in tubes 1 through 12, Starkiller missiles in the deep magazine, and the gravity bombs are showing green across the board. He paused, consulting his display with the reverence of a priest reading from a holy text. The quantum disruptors are particularly eager to meet some targets. They've been cooped up for too long. Thompson nodded as the ship's AI, nicknamed Cerberus by the crew, came online with the distinctive harmonic hum that indicated full system integration. Cerberus wasn't just any artificial intelligence. It had been programmed with the tactical knowledge and strategic thinking of humanity's greatest military minds. Napoleon's understanding of battlefield psychology, Alexander's aggressive expansion tactics, Patton's belief that the best defense was a crushing offense. The AI thought in terms of total war, complete victory, and the absolute destruction of anything that threatened its charges. Captain Cerberus reported, its voice carrying the cold precision of a machine that had been designed to calculate the most efficient ways to end conflicts. All systems operational, crew efficiency at maximum parameters. We are ready to demonstrate why fear is humanity's greatest export. Thompson's weathered face showed no emotion as he stared at the tactical displays showing the deployment of humanity's hidden fleet. Ships that had been kept secret for decades were finally emerging from their hiding places. Weapons that had been deemed too dangerous for civilized warfare were being loaded into firing chambers. And crews that had been trained to fight wars that nobody wanted to think about were finally getting their chance to prove their worth. Good, Thompson said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had spent his entire career preparing for this exact moment. It's time the galaxy learned that there are worse things than dying. And somewhere in the depths of space, the Devourer Horde continued their relentless advance, completely unaware that they had just awakened something that made them look like amateur predators. The fabric of space-time itself seemed to recoil as 400 human warships materialized at the edge of the Centauri borderlands, like vengeful ghosts stepping through the veil between dimensions. The hyperspace exit signatures alone registered on sensors 3 systems away, creating gravitational anomalies that shouldn't have been possible with conventional technology. But then again, nothing about humanity's approach to warfare had ever been conventional. Admiral Kexalon, Commander Veltar, as hastily promoted replacement, stood on the bridge of the Alliance's last remaining command, Vesselon crippled heavy cruiser that had barely escaped the latest Devourer assault, with half its crew and none of its dignity intact. His 4 arms trembled as he stared at sensor readings that his mind simply refused to accept as real. The quantum resonance scanners, devices capable of detecting energy signatures across 17 different dimensional phases, were literally overloading as they tried to process what they were seeing. "Sir," his chief sensor operator whispered, her voice carrying the kind of reverence usually reserved for witnessing natural disasters. "The readings they're off the scale. The human flagship alone is generating more power than our entire home defense grid." She paused, double-checking her instruments with the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the sensors were malfunctioning. Their escort vessels are individually reading as Class 12 threats. Our most advanced dreadnoughts barely registered as Class IX. Kexalon's compound eyes evolutionary marvels that could process visual information across multiple spectrums simultaneously were having trouble comprehending the sheer scale of what humanity had brought to their doorstep. The lead vessel, which his database identified as the USS Annihilator, stretched for over a mile through the void, like a black steel cathedral dedicated to the worship of controlled destruction. Its escort fleet formed a precise formation around it, each ship bristling with weapon systems that his tactical computer kept flagging as unknown technology threat assessment impossible. But it wasn't just the size or apparent firepower that made Kexalon's blood run cold. It was the way the ships moved. Every vessel in the human fleet maintained perfect formation discipline, their trajectories calculated with mathematical precision that suggested a level of coordination his own forces had never achieved even during peacetime exercises. These weren't desperate defenders thrown together in humanity's darkest hour. These were professional killers, operating at the peak of their capabilities. "Admiral," his communications officer called out, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. "We're receiving a transmission from the human flagship. It's addressed to you personally." The main display flickered to life, and Kexalon found himself staring into the face of someone who looked like death itself had taken human form and decided to go to war. Captain David Thompson's features seemed carved from granite that had been weathered by decades of impossible decisions and necessary cruelties. His eyes held the peculiar emptiness that came from having looked into the abyss so many times that it had become a familiar neighbor. Behind Thompson, the bridge of the Annihilator pulsed with red warning lights that cast everything in an ominous crimson glow, like the heart of some mechanical demon preparing to wake from a long slumber. Crew members moved with the fluid efficiency of a surgical team, each person focused on their assigned tasks with the kind of professional calm that only came from extensive practice with instruments of mass destruction. "This is Captain Thompson, of the Terran Defense Force," the human said, his voice carrying less emotion than a funeral director discussing burial arrangements. "We got your message." He paused, and in that moment of silence, Kexalon could hear the subtle background noise of the human ship, the barely audible hum of weapon systems charging, the whispered conversations of crew members running final system checks, the distant sound of something large and mechanical cycling through its operational parameters. "Point us toward what needs to die." The simple, direct statement hit Kexalon like a physical blow. Here was a representative of a species that the Alliance had spent 30 years portraying as barbaric warmongers, and he was speaking with the calm professionalism of someone discussing a routine maintenance procedure. There was no bravado, no dramatic speeches about justice or righteousness, just a straightforward request for target identification from someone who clearly considered the destruction of civilizations to be a technical problem with technical solutions. Kexalon found his voice had completely abandoned him. His throat worked soundlessly as his mind struggled to process the implications of what his desperate plea for help had actually summoned. The Alliance had always known, intellectually, that humanity possessed significant military capabilities there. Rapid expansion through their local stellar neighborhood, and the efficiency with which they had pacified their own system had made that clear enough. But knowing something intellectually, and witnessing it firsthand, were two entirely different experiences. This wasn't a rescue fleet. This wasn't even a military force in any sense that the Alliance understood the term. This was something far more terrifying. This was a collection of apex predators that had just been told that something in their galaxy needed killing, and they were approaching the problem with the methodical enthusiasm of professionals who had found their calling. "Sir," his tactical officer managed to stammer, "their weapon signatures are registering as Class 15 threats across the board. The classification system doesn't even go that high. Our computers are having to invent new threat categories just to process what we're seeing." And that's when the reality of the situation truly hit Kexalon, like a runaway freight train. The Alliance had created the Galactic Threat Classification System based on the most powerful weapons they could imagine. Class ICX represented the kind of firepower that could crack continents. Class X was theoretical, the sort of weapons that existed only in the nightmares of defense planners who spent too much time thinking about worst-case scenarios. The humans had apparently been using Class 10 as their starting point. "By the Ancient Ones," whispered his sensor operator, her voice filled with the kind of awe that primitive civilizations reserved for natural disasters. "Look at their formation discipline. Every ship is maintaining perfect positioning despite the gravitational interference from the binary stars. Their navigation systems must be processing calculations in real time that would take our best computers hours to complete." Kexalon watched as the human fleet began its approach, and something about their movement patterns triggered a primal response in his nervous system that millions of years of evolution had hardwired into his species' survival instincts. These ships moved like pack hunters, not the chaotic, desperate scrambling of prey animals, but the coordinated, purposeful advance of predators who had identified their target and were now moving to eliminate it with maximum efficiency. Each vessel maintained its position in the formation with mechanical precision, their engines burning with a controlled fury that suggested massive power reserves held in careful check. The escort destroyers flanked the larger ships like wolves protecting their pack leader, while squadrons of smaller craft fighters and interceptors that moved too fast for his sensors to track accurately darted between the capital ships in patterns that spoke of extensive training and absolute confidence in their abilities. "Admiral," his communications officer said, his voice barely above a whisper, "they're requesting target coordinates for the Devourer Horde's last known position." Kexalon stared at the tactical display, showing the human fleet's approach vector, and felt something inside his chest that might have been his heart trying to crawl up his throat and hide. The Alliance had summoned humanity to help them fight an enemy that had consumed 43 worlds and shattered the combined might of 17 different civilizations. They had expected desperate allies, maybe a few dozen ships crewed by volunteers willing to make a last stand against impossible odds. Instead, they had awakened something that made the Devourer Horde look like an amateur hour production. The humans weren't coming to help fight the monsters, they were coming to demonstrate why. In a galaxy full of predators, there was still something at the top of the food chain. Space itself seemed to bend around the human fleet as they adjusted course toward the coordinates Kexalon's trembling fingers transmitted to them. The Devourer Horde had spent millennia perfecting the art of consumption, turning entire civilizations into raw materials for their endless expansion. They were about to discover what it felt like when something decided to consume them. Instead, the Vega system had become a monument to cosmic horror, transformed from a thriving hub of interstellar commerce into something that would have made Dante himself reconsider his descriptions of hell. 30,000 biomechanical nightmares drifted through space like a metallic plague, their hulls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that spoke of absorbed civilizations and digested worlds. The Devourer horde had turned this once beautiful system into their feeding ground, and the evidence of their thousand-year reign of terror floated everywhere in the form of debris that had once been ships, stations, and the dreams of countless species. At the center of this grotesque constellation, the queen ships loomed like cancerous moons, each one a testament to evolutionary perfection, twisted into something obscene. These weren't just vessels, they were living ecosystems that had grown fat on the life force of 43 worlds. Their biomechanical hulls, incorporating the technology and genetic material of every civilization they had consumed. Sensor readings from the approaching human fleet showed energy signatures that defied conventional physics, as if the laws of nature themselves had been bent to serve the horde's insatiable hunger. For a millennium, these creatures had represented the absolute pinnacle of predatory evolution. They had faced the elegant energy weapons of the crystalline hegemony and adapted within hours, their hulls developing perfect reflective properties that turned those beautiful light-based attacks into harmless displays. They had encountered the quantum entanglement minds of the void dancers and learned to phase shift through dimensions, making themselves effectively untouchable by conventional weapons. The Alliance's own forces, with their precisely coordinated fleet tactics and mathematically perfect firing solutions, had lasted exactly 47 minutes. Against the Horde's adaptive capabilities, the Devourers had crushed every military force they had ever encountered, growing stronger with each victory, more intelligent with each absorbed civilization, more terrifying with each world they stripped bare. They were, by every measurable standard, evolution's perfect, killing machine apex. Predators that had reached the absolute summit of destructive capability. They had never encountered humanity's approach to warfare. The USS Annihilator materialized at the edge of the Vega system like a blade made of crystallized violence, its massive bulk casting shadows across space itself. Captain Thompson stood on his bridge, surrounded by displays showing targeting solutions that would have been considered war crimes by 17 different galactic conventions, and felt something that might have been satisfaction settle into his bones. The Horde had made a fundamental error in their calculations. They had assumed that all species approached conflict with the same basic parameters, the same underlying logic, the same evolutionary constraints. Humanity had never been constrained by logic when it came to finding new ways to kill things. The Annihilator didn't announce its presence with the kind of dramatic communication that marked most interstellar conflicts. There were no demands for surrender, no appeals to reason, no attempts at negotiation. Thompson simply looked at his weapons officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Bulldog Harrison, and gave the kind of nod that had preceded some of humanity's most efficient massacres. "Light them up, Bulldog," the universe screamed. Antimatter cascades erupted from the Annihilator's primary batteries like controlled supernovas, each one releasing more destructive energy than most civilizations produced in a year. The beams tore through Devourer formations with the inexorable force of natural disasters, but these weren't the predictable energy weapons the Horde had learned to counter. Human military engineers had spent decades studying every known form of adaptive defense, then designed weapons specifically to make adaptation impossible. The antimatter didn't just destroy, it consumed, creating chain reactions that spread from ship to ship like wildfire through a forest of paper. Devourer vessels that had survived direct hits from planet-cracking weapons simply ceased to exist, their adaptive hulls unable to process destruction on such a fundamental level. But that was just the opening act. Quantum torpedoes streaked through space like missiles made of compressed reality, each one carrying a payload that would have made theoretical physicists weep with terror. Upon impact, they didn't just explode, they collapsed space-time itself. creating brief but devastating black holes that devoured everything within their event horizons. Entire swarms of devourer fighters simply vanished, pulled into gravitational anomalies that treated the laws of physics like gentle suggestions. "Jesus Christ," whispered Master Chief Walsh from her position at the tactical console, watching her displays light up with destruction signatures that shouldn't have been possible. "Sir, we're reading complete matter conversion across grid sectors 7 through 15. Those weren't explosions, those were localized big bangs." Thompson's weathered face showed no emotion as he watched a 1,000-year-old terror reduced to elementary particles. This was what humanity brought to the cosmic table, not just superior firepower, but weapons that operated on principles so fundamentally different from conventional warfare that adaptation became meaningless. You couldn't evolve a defense against the complete restructuring of reality itself. Colonel Michelle Rodriguez's assault carrier Vengeance had taken a different approach to the problem, launching wave after wave of hunter-killer drones that moved through space like mechanical wolves, scenting blood. But these weren't ordinary military automatons. Each drone was programmed with the collective tactical knowledge of every human warrior who had ever lived. From ancient samurai sword techniques to modern orbital bombardment strategies, they moved with an intelligence that transcended mere programming, adapting their attack patterns in real time, based on the combat wisdom of 10,000 years of human warfare. "Ma'am," her executive officer reported, his voice tight with professional excitement. "The Hellhound squadrons are reporting successful target acquisition across all vectors. The drones are Jesus. They're learning faster than the Devourers can adapt. It's like watching evolution in fast forward." Rodriguez's smile was sharp enough to cut steel. The drones weren't just attacking, they were teaching each other, sharing tactical innovations across their network faster than biological evolution could possibly respond. For every adaptation the Devourers managed, the Hunter-Killers developed 3 counter-adaptations, creating a feedback loop that turned the Horde's greatest strength into a fatal weakness. Meanwhile, Commander Tyler Brooks had taken his squadron of stealth destroyers and done something that would have been impossible for any other species in the galaxy. They had materialized inside the Devourer formations, their cloaking technology allowing them to bypass the Horde's adaptive sensors entirely. Brooks' ships weren't designed for elegant long-range combat. They were built for the kind of close-quarters brutality that left no survivors and fewer questions. "All ships, execute Protocol Sledgehammer," Brooks commanded, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent his entire career perfecting the art of killing things at point-blank range. The stealth destroyers opened fire with fusion rams, weapons that were less like conventional missiles and more like controlled stellar events compressed into projectile form. They punched through the Horde's queen ships like bullets through tissue paper, each impact creating miniature stars that burned through biomechanical hulls as if they were made of wet cardboard. But here's where things got really interesting, and this is something that would have made alien military theorists reconsider their understanding of psychological warfare entirely. Humanity had spent considerable time studying the Devourer Horde's communication methods, learning that these creatures operated through a complex hive mind network that allowed them to share information and coordinate attacks across vast distances. So, the humans decided to hack their network and drive them completely insane. Captain Thompson had authorized the deployment of humanity's most terrifying psychological weapon, not fear, not pain, but something far more destructive to a hive consciousness that had never encountered anything like it. The human fleet began broadcasting across all subspace frequencies, the one sound that represented everything the Devourers couldn't understand or adapt to: human laughter. Not just any laughter, but specifically the kind of laughter that came from people who found genuine joy in warfare, who treated destruction as an art form, who looked at impossible odds and saw them as interesting challenges. The laughter of fighter pilots diving into enemy formations, of Marines charging uphill into superior firepower, of engineers who designed weapons for the pure, intellectual satisfaction of creating something that had never existed before. The effect on the Horde was immediate and catastrophic. Their hive mind evolved to process tactical information and adaptive responses. Simply couldn't comprehend a species that approached warfare with such evident pleasure. The psychological feedback loop created by exposure to human combat psychology shattered their collective consciousness like glass, leaving individual devourer ships confused, disoriented, and utterly incapable of coordinating their defenses. Within 8 hours, less time than it took most species to plan a single engagement, a horde that had taken centuries to build and had conquered 43 worlds was reduced to scattered, fleeing fragments. The survivors, their collective intelligence fragmented beyond repair, transmitted desperate warnings across subspace and every frequency their damaged communication systems could access. Avoid the Sol system. The humans are awake. They laugh while they kill. Evolution has no defense against madness. Captain Thompson stood on his bridge, watching the last functional devourer vessel limp toward the edge of the system, its biohull weeping strange fluids that sparkled in the light of Vega's primary star. Around him, his crew maintained their posts with the professional calm that came from having successfully completed a task they had trained their entire careers to accomplish. But he could see the satisfaction in their eyes, the quiet pride of craftsmen who had just demonstrated their mastery of their chosen profession. This was what they had been born for. This was why the galaxy feared them. And somewhere in the depths of space, the remnants of 1,000-year terror were discovering that there were predators in the universe that made them look like amateur enthusiasts. The age of the devourer horde was over. The age of humanity had just begun. 6 months after the Vega system had been transformed from a nightmare into a debris field, Admiral Jack Morrison found himself standing in a place he had never expected to see: the rebuilt chambers of the Galactic Council on New Geneva Station. The irony wasn't lost on him that humanity's first official diplomatic appearance in 30 years was taking place on a station that bore the name of a human city, built with technology that incorporated human engineering principles, orbiting a star that humans had been the first to successfully colonize. The chamber itself was a marvel of interspecies cooperation, designed to accommodate the physiological needs of dozens of different alien races. Atmospheric processors maintained 17 different breathing environments. Gravity generators created localized fields to suit species ranging from low-gravity gas bag creatures to high-density rock dwellers, and the lighting systems produced a spectrum that allowed everyone present to see clearly, regardless of their evolved visual capabilities. What struck Morrison most profoundly, however, wasn't the technical achievement represented by the council chambers. It was the way every single alien representative in the room looked at him. These were the survivors, the remnants of civilizations that had once commanded fleets numbering in the thousands and controlled territories spanning multiple star systems. Now they sat in chairs designed for beings twice their current numbers, their eyes holding a mixture of desperate gratitude and bone-deep terror that Morrison recognized from his own mirror during the darkest days of the Titan Wars. Council-Prime Zordon, a being whose species had once been among the most vocal advocates for humanity's quarantine, shifted nervously in his adaptive chair as Morrison approached the speaker's podium. The alien's bioluminescent skin patterns, normally a brilliant display of blues and greens that indicated confidence and authority, had faded to the pale, washed-out colors that his species displayed when confronting existential threats. "Admiral," Morrison Zordon began, his voice carrying the careful modulation of someone trying very hard not to say the wrong thing. "We have gathered today to formally acknowledge humanity's assistance in our recent crisis. The Galactic Peace Alliance owes you a debt that we are not certain we can ever properly repay." Morrison stood at the podium, his weathered hands resting on a surface that had been designed by committee to offend no one and impress everyone. He looked out at the assembled representatives and felt something that might have been pity settle. into his chest. These beings had spent 30 years convinced that humanity represented an existential threat to galactic civilization, never realizing that they had been looking at the problem completely backwards. The Devourer horde is extinct, Morrison reported with the same matter-of-fact tone he might have used to discuss the weather forecast. We tracked down every last fragment, every hidden nest, every escape pod that managed to flee the initial engagement. Our deep space reconnaissance fleet spent 4 months conducting what our military refers to as pest control operations across 17 different sectors. He paused, allowing the implications to sink in. They will never threaten anyone again. The silence that followed was so complete that Morrison could hear the subtle background hum of the station's life support systems, the distant whisper of air recycling through atmospheric processors, and what sounded suspiciously like one of the methane-breathing delegates trying not to hyperventilate. Council Prime, Zordan's skin patterns had gone completely colorless, which Morrison's cultural briefings had informed him was the alien equivalent of a human turning white as a sheet. And your ... compensation demands? Zordan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. This was the moment that Morrison had been anticipating and dreading for months. The question revealed so much about how the Alliance fundamentally misunderstood humanity that it was almost painful to contemplate. They were still thinking in terms of conquest and submission, of victors claiming spoils from the defeated, of transactions and exchanges, and the careful balance of power that had defined galactic politics for millennia. Morrison's expression didn't change as he delivered the words that would reshape the political landscape of known space. We want nothing from you. We never did. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the sound of several delegates simultaneously attempting to process information that their political frameworks simply couldn't accommodate. For decades, the Alliance had operated under the assumption that humanity's isolation was a form of punishment, that Earth had been quarantined because humans were too dangerous, too aggressive, too fundamentally incompatible with civilized society to be allowed free movement through the galaxy. They had never considered that. Maybe, just maybe, humanity had been protecting them. Morrison watched the implications dawn on face after alien face around the chamber. The quarantine hadn't been a cage designed to keep humanity in. It had been a safety barrier designed to keep everything else out. Earth's apparent acceptance of their isolation hadn't been submission to superior force. It had been the patience of apex predators, allowing prey animals to believe they were safe. However, Morrison continued, his voice carrying the weight of humanity's newfound position in the galactic hierarchy. Things are going to change. Earth is no longer under quarantine. Human ships will travel where they please, explore what they choose to explore, and establish colonies wherever we see fit. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the assembled representatives. We will, of course, respect existing territorial claims and establish trade routes. We're not conquerors, we're explorers, who happen to be very, very good at solving certain types of problems. Council Prime Zordan found his voice, though it trembled with the effort. And if conflicts arise, if territorial disputes develop, if some species objects to human expansion. Morrison's smile was colder than the space between stars. Well, you've seen what we do to monsters. The statement hung in the air like a physical presence, carrying implications that made several delegates visibly flinch. But here's the thing about humans that you've never understood. We don't start fights, we just finish them, definitively. The message was clear enough that even the most politically naive delegate in the chamber couldn't miss it. Humanity wasn't interested in conquests or domination. They were interested in making sure that certain types of problems never arose again. The Devourer horde had been a problem. Now it was extinct. Anyone else who developed similar ambitions could expect similar treatment. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Captain David Thompson was experiencing something that would have seemed impossible. Just 6 months earlier, normal afternoon with his family. He walked through the corridors of Lincoln Elementary School, watching his daughter Emma play with her friends during recess. The children laughed and ran, and dreamed of futures filled with wonder, blissfully unaware that their parents were the galaxy's most efficient killers. Emma caught sight of him through the classroom window and waved enthusiastically, her grin lighting up her entire face. She was 7 years old, fascinated by butterflies and dinosaurs, and absolutely convinced that her daddy had the coolest job in the universe. Though she wasn't entirely clear on what that job actually involved, Thompson waved back, feeling something in his chest that might have been peace. This was what they had been fighting for, not glory, not conquest, not even the satisfaction of defeating a worthy enemy. They had been fighting for the right of children to play without fear, to dream without terror, to grow up in a universe where the monsters stayed properly dead. His communicator chimed with the distinctive tone that indicated a priority message from Fleet Command. Thompson's scarred face hardened into its familiar mask of controlled fury as he read the briefing. Another distress call, this time from the Andromeda Relay. Slavers had attacked a refugee convoy carrying survivors from one of the outer colony worlds, and the local authorities were requesting assistance with what they diplomatically termed a law enforcement issue. Thompson looked through the window at his daughter, who was now engaged in what appeared to be a serious discussion with her best friend about the relative merits of different types of flowers. Emma had inherited her mother's love of growing things, her fascination with life and beauty, and all the small miracles that made existence worthwhile. He kissed Emma goodbye, promising to be home in time for dinner, and headed back to his ship. The Annihilator was docked at the military facility just outside the city, its crew already running pre-flight checks based on the mission parameters that had been transmitted ahead of Thompson's arrival. "Sir," Master Chief Walsh reported as Thompson stepped onto his bridge, "We've got good intelligence on the slaver operation. Looks like they've been operating in that sector for about 6 months. Hitting refugee convoys and selling the survivors to mining operations in the Outer Rim." She paused, consulting her tactical display. Estimated force strength is 12 ships, mostly converted freighters with military-grade weapons. Thompson nodded, settling into his captain's chair with the familiarity of someone putting on a comfortable old coat. "Time to destination. 18 hours at maximum burn, sir." "Make it 12, Thompson commanded. "I promised my daughter I'd be home for dinner tomorrow." As the Annihilator slipped away from Earth's orbital facilities and began its acceleration toward the jump point, Thompson reflected on the fundamental truth that the galaxy was still learning to accept. The universe was full of monstrous beings who preyed on the innocent, who treated suffering as entertainment, who believed that strength gave them the right to inflict cruelty on those weaker than themselves. But the universe was also full of humans, and humans had spent their entire evolutionary history perfecting a very specific skill set. They were very, very good at killing monsters. The age of peace, built on the comfortable illusion that predators could be reasoned with and threats could be managed through diplomacy, was over. The age of justice, swift, final, and absolutely certain, had begun. And somewhere in the depths of space, the slavers who had made the mistake of attacking innocent refugees were about to discover why the galaxy's newest protectors smiled when they went to war. The end.